we're very happy in India. We like open weights. We would prefer complete open source, but we do like open weights. But Rob, when it comes to the AI discussion between the US, India, and Tarun just said is that, look, there are three parts which we could do more on, right? AI, biopharma, nuclear. Semiconductor is a little mature, but we'll talk about it, John. Luckily, these are all the three things that we workshopped over the last 2 days. We're going to bake it into trust, and someone important is going to talk about it at Indrani's forum at the end of the month, hopefully, right? But the meta story with India and the Llama story with India seems to be very much a good national story of US-India. Just give us a sense of what you think should happen from an AI infrastructure perspective to cement that even further.
Well, first of all, thank you for the conversation. I mean, it's been a fascinating day, and it feels like we are really at an inflection point in both the US-India relationship around tech, and then more generally the promise of this technology for all of us. So just really excited to be here. Minister Jaishankar mentioned this earlier today, the speech that Vice President Vance gave in Paris. And there he talked about the US wanting to be sort of the preferred trading partner for the world when it comes to AI. And he also said that it's really important for trust to be a part of those relationships. And so I think it's fitting that the framework that PM Modi and the President of the United States agreed to is called trust, and really focuses on what does it look like to have this kind of collaboration. And I think that, when I think about sort of what are the building blocks that are necessary for something like that to exist and for it to be good for the United States and good for India, I think there are a couple of pieces, some of which exist already and some of which we need to build. So the first is, of course, and this is, this piece is kind of long-standing between the US and India, is a robust developer ecosystem and a robust technical collaboration. So you mentioned Llama 4. We just released the newest version and most advanced Llama models ever this past weekend. And what we've seen is this sort of trend of building foundation models, open sourcing them so that people can build on top of them. And we already have, for example, we have a developer here in India that's taken Llama 3 and built an agriculture-specific model. So, for example, so specifically tuned to agricultural practices here in India. So it's a domestic model that is specific to India, but that leverages the foundation model and the training that we've done centrally with Llama. And that's something that we've done, again, with this next model. But the goal there is really, if you think about the sort of history of collaboration between Bangalore and the tech ecosystem there and Silicon Valley is just a very storied thing. So that's one thing. I think the second thing that's really important is data. And we talk a lot about inclusion and the importance of data in building models. And something that MIAT has been really focused on for quite some time, as you know, is building curated data sets, making sure that if you're building an AI model and you want it to serve a country like India, it needs to be trained on data from India. It needs to understand Indian language, Indian concepts. And so part of that is creating data sets that can be used, and that's something the government of India has invested pretty heavily in. There's also other work to be done around privacy and copyright and those sorts of things. But the final one, and I think the one that's specifically called out in the trust framework that was announced coming out of the PM's visit to DC, is around infrastructure. And I think it's hard to deny that, especially when you're talking about the most advanced models in the world, that infrastructure and both compute and then also connectivity is really critical. And so I think that's something that we'll hear a lot more about as time goes on. But something that we've actually just recently announced is a project, Waterworth, which is basically the most advanced, probably the most advanced or one of the most advanced infrastructure projects ever anticipated. And it'll be a subsea cable that will connect the US and India, and then hopefully be to a huge advantage to both governments and people in both places in terms of giving them access to the technology and the connectivity that is necessary to be a first-class participant in this AI revolution. So I think those are the three big pieces that I hope will be a part of the discussion, but I think particularly making sure that we're investing in infrastructure that connects the two markets is going to be really critical.
Thanks, Rob. I'm going to come back to you on a question on controls, and I want to come back to you on the question of what does it take for the AI infrastructure piece to really succeed? Because it seems like an interesting model, which is the general trend in the current Trump White House is inward investments into the US. But on AI, it's interesting. the key issue seems to be big investments from the US into India for data centers. And the question is about deregulation in India and factor markets to make that more possible. So I'm going to come back to you on both those points. But John, it segues quite nicely to semiconductors. I think I said this yesterday in the closed door, but I'll say it again. I remember listening to you. It was January of 2023. The National Security Advisor was sitting next to then Jake Sullivan. They launched ISET in the chambers. Semiconductors were a big piece of the ISET piece. And you were very enthusiastic about what ISET could do for semiconductors. Are you still enthusiastic of what ISET did for semiconductors?
100%. I'd just like to say thanks for being here, and I learn something new every time I come to India. I just learned the word prepone, which is, anyway, it is great to be here. India has done a lot right when it comes to our sector. 20% of our workforce is here. You have for design of our chips. You have a great ecosystem for that. I think we're at in a very special moment right now. We have this trust initiative in front of us, but we also have a bilateral trade agreement in front of us. And I think those are two potential vectors for change that can really make a difference as India moves from not just design, but also into the manufacture side of things. India has made some great progress so far. 2 years ago, there was really nothing in play. Now there's 6 important projects in play for manufacturing, including the assembly test packaging facility being built by Micron out in Gujarat. So I think there's been some great progress made so far. As India thinks about the next step in this area, I think there's many links on our supply chain that should be turned to. One of them is continuing on the assembly test packaging piece of this. Someday India is going to have a $10 billion, $20 billion fab.
Sorry, John, if I could ask you to put the mic up.
Someday India is going to have a $10, $20 billion logic fab, but not yet. That's a great aspiration. It's got to work up to that, take small bites of the apple. The other piece that's not talked enough about is India should look at PCBs, printed circuit boards. That's an important part of our supply chain. And then finally, critical minerals. There is one country that does a ton of processing of those critical minerals. And in this regard, and I think just generally, we are in an era where diversification of our supply chains is going to accelerate. So I think that's opportunity for a lot of players around the world, but in particular, India. Our market size right now is about $600 billion a year in sales. Because of AI, automotive, many other sectors demanding our chips, we're probably going to be a $1 trillion sector by 2030. So the pie is getting bigger overall, and if India plays its cards right, its piece of pie will become even bigger.
Oh, thanks, John. I'm going to come back to the question of fab, onshore, friendshore, contradictions, opportunities for India. So that's the other one coming to you in a bit. But Siddharth, if I could come to you, you're the CEO of a very large biopharma firm. In fact, I think your chairperson, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, set this up back in the day in 2016 with External Affairs Minister and others. When we were in the White House in February, what I found was intriguing. The one thing that they were laser focused on was bio and pharma, right? I mean, there are a whole bunch of other issues, but the general consensus was we need to get this right, we need to cooperate, and of course, from an American perspective, it was we need investments inside of America. Let's leave that aside for a second. I don't want to put you on the spot. What more needs to be done from your perspective to, let's say, just grow a good ecosystem between the two countries when it comes to biopharma?
Well, thanks, Rudra, for having me here. I think it's a great pleasure to be representing the industry in a tech summit, because the whole fact that biopharmaceutical is part of this and it's a part of the trust initiative, I think is very encouraging. I think you rightly said that when in Feb biopharmaceutical found its way into trust framework, I think the reason is national security. I think we talk about defense, we talk about technology, but at the end of it, what saves lives of people on a grassroots level is medicine, right? And India and US has had a partnership since 4 decades, actually, on this side, because when the Hatch-Waxman Act was introduced in the US in mid-80s, India has been supplying drugs to the US, generic drugs. And if you look at the power of the generic industry, which is 90% of the volumes of drugs in the US, is generic, which represents only 10% of the value. Now, there is a huge opportunity. Today, I mean, 40% or 50% of the volume of the drugs consumed by patients in the US comes from India. And I think that already speaks a lot about the partnership that we've had over 4 decades, informally, right? Now, how do you take it to the next level? And I think there has been, most Indian companies who have set up their facilities in the US to manufacture drug product. And today, if you look at India as an ally of US, and considering we are in this together as one to solve multiple issues, it's not only national security, it's the cost, it's the affordability, because the price is paid by patients or the payers, and there is a price-sensitive market, even though US is the biggest pharmaceutical market, but is also very price-sensitive. So how do you work together and how do you synergize? And I think there are a couple of points. India has a scale. I think that's very important. India has the talent, and India has a good understanding of the entire ecosystem. US, of course, has a great research ecosystem. And I think that's where I see a first opportunity, that how do you join hands to innovate in US or create joint innovation hubs to do same thing in a different way. And I'll tell you, there is a connect to China angle, because why, when we talk about national security, why do we talk pharmaceutical? Is because of over-dependency and reliance on China. So, and when you look at the entire ecosystem of pharmaceutical, while the API is manufactured in India and US, formulations mostly in India, but India is still dependent 70% on China to procure its starting materials or raw materials. So if we do not address the entire value chain, we'll not fix the problem, because somewhere or the other we will be dependent on China, and there's a cartelization and so on and so forth, which everybody is aware of. So how do you address it at the grassroots level? And that's where I think innovation is the fundamental thing that I would focus on. That how do you innovate to manufacture drugs which have been manufactured for decades in a more efficient way? I think there's been focus of technology, that how do you do things in a efficient, using green technology, using flow chemistry, using a better enzymatic technology. There's so much happening. And I think, of course, American universities are at the forefront of such research and innovation, and how can they partner with Indian companies, Indian institutions to bring that knowledge in a very systematic way so that we address it at the grassroots level, and then create an ecosystem and infrastructure on key starting materials, intermediates, raw materials. So we are independent of some countries, and we are kind of resilient in our supply chain.
No, I'm glad you brought up the de-risking API piece, and maybe so that as a follow-on in a bit, I'll come back on what's the business model, because in the end, there's got to be a business model or a state incentive or some sort of a financial packages that actually gets the two sides. And I think over the next 10 days, if you can work that business model out, then there'll be good announcement on what can be done. But Indrani, let me come to you. Just a broad question. You've come back from Washington. What's the mood of the nation?
Do you really want me to say this?
This is a good closed door, don't worry. No cameras.
Well, thank you, Rudy, and thank you for putting me on the spot there. I think they're still finding their feet is the most optimistic assessment of what I saw in Washington. And I think it will be a little while longer for them to settle down. The current policy of flooding the zone with disruptive policies has some takers, but it has caused disruption, as you would have seen, across the world. And I think for everybody to come to terms with that would take a little bit of time.
That's great, and it's a good answer. But let me just push you on that a little bit before I come to Ashley. The general sense that we have, and you've more recently spent time in DC, general ambition for India is still high, notwithstanding 90 days and all of that, and I'll come to all of that, very important. General ambition seems to be high, and the tech ambition, generally the sense we get is high. Is that right?
Absolutely. So the general ambition, I think, from the US end, and frankly from the Indian end as well, remains very high. And it's not like India didn't expect the tariffs to come down. I think among many countries, Indians even had a sense of the band where the tariffs that would be imposed on India. I think India played well by preempting the entire tariff rollout with a bilateral trade agreement by starting the negotiations for a BTA. I suspect the BTA will be done sooner rather than later, and that will be a first for India because we are not known to do trade agreements at such a fast clip. So I think there are those that are at work. What we have to get over is not trust as in the acronym, but what we have to get over is serial disruption. And if we can achieve a space where both sides understand that a win is necessary for both sides, and it is not a might is right kind of an agreement, then we will be at a desired space much faster. So that's a long way of giving a very short answer.
So the main aim is let's design that win-win as soon as possible, and we can.
Yeah. Well, I think the idea is that we are. The US is coming from a place where they believe that they have been victimized, they have been hurt by the rest of the world. We come from a place where we believe if we open up hard enough and fast enough, then everybody will come and swamp us and we will be left nowhere. So I think both have to come to a middle position.
Okay, and excuse my informality, but just for the organizers, that was Mr. Pal. He's on his way. You may just want to connect with him. Sorry. Okay, great. Ashley, certainly not the last. I saved the best for the last if the rest don't mind. This morning, the External Affairs Minister talked about the 2 Ts. And we talked about it so much that I got a little confused on which T we were talking about at some point. There's one T that landed yesterday. We'll keep that T out. 2 Ts are important. I wonder in general, in the bureaucratic landscape in India, do we fully appreciate that 1 T is as sharp as it is, notwithstanding the 90-day pause? And just take kind of trust at a larger context is how important is it going to be to get that T sorted the best that it can for this smaller T to actually happen? Hi, sir. Good to see you.
So thanks for having me. It's great to be back. Let me say a couple of things to that. I have been really surprised at how energized the Indian government has been to address the tariff T long before the tariffs were actually levied. I think there was great perspicacity in judging that tariffs were going to come down the line, that India was going to be among the most prominent victims of tariffs. And in a quite striking departure from India's normal modus operandi of, waiting for the world to hit it and then sort of adjusting, India moved preemptively, in fact, before the president was even inaugurated, in order to signal a willingness to address America's trade grievances. What we have seen since those early conversations has now been backed up with an extraordinary level of detail that has been conveyed to our trade negotiators. For me, the big risks are not in the Indian response. For me, the big risk is that at the US end, we will be overwhelmed by the number of such negotiations that have to be conducted simultaneously, and that there may not be enough bureaucratic capability to move on the timelines that India wants to be satisfied by. That's one big challenge which we have. There's a second challenge which has to do with sequencing. India has put very bold proposals on the table. It is likely that if we are successful, we will see a diminution of the executive tariffs that Trump has levied. In the best of all worlds, those tariffs will be completely eliminated, and we will go back to the status quo ante. But for a really successful outcome, you can't simply stop at the level of executive tariffs. You have to engage a much larger set of issues relating to MFN tariffs. And MFN tariffs do not lie within the purview of the president to change. Only Congress can do that. And the mood in Congress is so dramatically anti-trade at this point, is so suspicious of providing tariff relief, that India may end up front-loading a lot of the sacrifices and then ending up in a situation where the US cannot deliver bigger fundamental changes on the MFN tariff side, which will come simply out of necessity down the line. So it's that juggling that I think will take the time and attention of senior leaders over the next several months. And obviously we have to be optimistic enough that this comes out right. My hope is that even as we do this, because there is really seriousness of intent, both in Ministry of Commerce and in USTR, my hope is that that will not disrupt the things that are underway in the other T. And if we can sustain that through the National Security Advisor's visit, the Vice President's visit, and so on and so forth, then we may be able to squeeze, make lemonade with the lemons that we have. So fingers crossed, fingers crossed.
There's another lemon, it's called nuclear. So I just want to come to that for a second. If I understood you, Ashley, the general sense seems to be, so the sense we had is that there's a sequential logic between US and India at the moment. You need to do a couple of things in order for that ambition that Indrani detected to really unleash itself on a whole bunch of other things, defense, AI infrastructure, bio, so on and so forth. What you're saying now is that perhaps because of the way the tariffs negotiations are going, there's a little bit more space. But on the sequential logic, nuclear is right up there, right? What needs to happen on the nuclear side, keeping timelines in mind and keeping our legislative timeline in mind over the next couple of months so that we can actually get the other stuff that Siddharth and Rob and John and all are talking about going. And I'll come to you in a second, so I'm allowing you to just get your breath. Okay, Ashley.
So I want to start with the point that Indrani made, because I think we need to appreciate this if you have to appreciate the answer I'm going to give you on nuclear. The US is starting out from a position of deep-seated grievances, that somehow the international system has treated it unfairly, and that a whole series of complaints have to be rectified. Nuclear sort of features in this list because there is a view that an agreement was signed now almost 20 years ago, and the US has not enjoyed the fruits of that agreement. And so this is piled onto that perspective of grievances. which means it is now incumbent on us to sort of act with alacrity, precisely because it has become a door opener. I mean, in a different world, we would have not had this necessity to overcome this obstacle. We could have done it at our own pace. The difficulty we have now is that the timelines to do it at the Indian end, because India is a democracy, it is a complicated legislative process to make the transformations in the law work out. Those timelines may not be entirely in sync with the expectations of the leadership in the White House. And so, I mean, there is no easy fix to this, right? India cannot abridge its legislative processes to satisfy our political needs, no matter how necessary that may be. So I think what we have to do is engage in a very serious conversation between the two sides about what the processes involved are. And some of that is literally involves elementary education, right? We need to understand when India needs to change laws, what are the things that have to happen. This is a new team. Many of the people in this team are not familiar with India. They don't understand India except at the level of 80,000 feet. So I see the next few months as being really important in terms of having these exchanges about process. I'm confident that at the end of the day, we will get an outcome that will be satisfactory. The real question is, will we have the patience enough to wait? Because the last thing, and I said this yesterday, I said, you know, after 20 years, we cannot have the risk of having a half-baked solution, which then we trade charges over for the next 20 years. So in my prejudice is, take the time needed, do it right, and that will be a far better outcome than rushing through a process that ends up, that is half-baked, and then takes us back to square one.
Okay. No, thanks, Ashley. And I think time seems to be the key one. And messengers, perhaps such as yourself, I think that role is going to be very, very important, especially with, with everything that you've just said. I'm going to come back to you on other parts of the trust framework around defense in a second. Mr. Pal, if I could turn to you. You held the ISET account in the Ministry of Electronics. You hold the trust account. You're also the interim CEO of our semiconductor mission. Could I just ask you to start with taking a step back, saying, on the ISET part, what worked for you when it came to semiconductors? Because from our perspective, from the outside, it looked like semiconductors was the big win of ISET. Do you feel the same way? And what do you want to do under the trust framework or under the AI infrastructure framework when it comes to semiconductors?
Thanks, Rudra, and apologies for being delayed here. I think, yes, ISET has been one of the most productive bilateral cooperation with the US. And I wouldn't want to name the companies here, but then, yes, I think the first India's semiconductor plant was with a cooperation from American industry, and the production from the pilot facilities have already started. And hopefully, by the end of the year, I think, from the main facility as well, I think it should be starting. Apart from that, not only in the fabrication and packaging space, but also in the design space, I think there has been a massive collaboration and interest being shown by the many companies of US origin. And from the design, I'll go to again on the R&D side as well as the equipment space. I mean, if you talk about the whole ecosystem, and there again, I think we have a strong participation and interest being shown by companies from US. I mean, be it Applied Material or be it Lam Research. I mean, establishing actually a product validation center here, a huge R&D center here, and Lam as well. Again, a huge R&D center, and also taking up the program of skilling some 60,000 professionals in semiconductor. The first batch has already finished training, second batch is on. So it covers the complete spectrum of the semiconductor value chain, right from the design to the fabrication to the tail-end building to the R&D and all that. And moving from the ISET, I think trust has been, I think it's actually built on the ISET platform, I would say, and in far more comprehensive manner. It's one framework which sees semiconductor and the technological security and national security with one lens. It's, that's a very encouraging part. And it actually lays down the blueprint of collaboration, technological collaboration between India and US. The most important part of the trust element is that it does clearly talk about accepting that, US, they'll redouble the efforts to reduce the trade barriers. That's the most significant part, and also it commits itself to kind of enhance in high-end technologies, right? To enhance trade in the high-end technologies, and also to reduce other trade tariff barriers as well. So these things clearly kind of lay down the path that US and India, both are heavily committed in a high-end technology and advanced technology collaboration. So that's one which is very emphatically been brought out in the trust framework. And another which is, as I said, that it's pretty comprehensive framework, and it also recognizes the very important role of the critical minerals, which these critical minerals play in these semiconductors as well as in AI. So it does recognize the importance of these critical minerals, and talks about cooperation in both in the extraction, beneficiation, as well as the processing of critical minerals. I think both of us are a part of a framework, but then again, there has been a further deepening of collaboration, and there's a SMRI, I recall the Strategic Mineral Recovery Initiative, which has been signed between the both, which has been announced by both the leaders. So I think that's also an important element. And as I said, it covers technology in a complete perspective, be it national security, be it energy security, be it normal trade and investment. So I think, yes, we do see that the trust will, take the level of cooperation to another level, I'm sure.
Can I come back to you with one question? The joint statement essentially seems, in a sense, a bit easy on export controls. There's a very big paragraph on making efforts on ITAR. So any reflections you have on that would be great. You've already been in some early conversations, perhaps with US counterparts, I don't know. But second has been on ITAR, the export control regime. But apart from that, we've had a lot of murmur and a lot of discussion around AI diffusion. And if you want AI infrastructure and an ecosystem to build between the two sides, I'm guessing from India's perspective, we want to be at least in category 1 or no category at all. We don't want to be number 2 or 3. So any general reflections or any vibes you're getting from the US side on how they're thinking about the regulatory architecture for infrastructure?
I'll just skip the answer to the ITAR part, let that be handled between the government to government rather than we talking in the forums like this. But yes, AI diffusion framework, I think we got this, we got this mindset of, getting classified into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, when, either be it regarding to the trade export control obligations or in a similar fashion into the, tier 1, tier 2, 3 in the AI diffusion framework. But then I would rather say look at the intent of the leaders rather than looking at the categories, because, it requires some process on the part of the US. I think some approval of the Senate and all, I think, as Ashley was pointing out, right, that there's a governance process on both sides and it takes time, right? So it will depend upon the legislative approvals on the US side. I would not go into that, but then the extent of technological collaboration which has been extended by the US during the ISET regime, I think it does cross the boundaries of the categories you fall into in terms of the trade export control regime, right? So, and yes, I think in AI diffusion, it does seem like a limitation in terms of the number of GPUs which, to which you might have access to in the next 4 or 5 years. But then if you look at the trust leaders' announcements in the trust, one of the announcement is the accelerated AI infrastructure partnership, right? So if you still want to, you can't be committing itself to, accelerated partnership for creating AI infra if you want to limit yourself to the 50,000 or 40,000 GPUs, right? And then the kind of a work plan which we are engaging with the US side, I think it does talk about, or even the framework itself, it talks about reducing the barriers to the financing, reducing the barriers to the building the data infrastructure or data centers, and it talks about industry participation and increasing the investment of the industry in creation of data centers, cooperation in the large language model, access to compute. You cannot have all these, right? If you're still looking at whatever ceiling there is in everybody's mind, depending upon the kind of a GPU with regard to the processing power. So I'm pretty positive. I think I don't see that as a roadblock. I'm sure with the intent shown by the leaders, I think it won't be a challenge. I'm positive.
No, thanks, Mr. Palan. Now we're going to have to be intellectually agile and move on different dimensions of trust. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock. Rob, open models, export controls, are you worried?
I am not. I think it's an important area to focus on, and I think there's still open discussion about it. But I think everybody benefits from having open models. India benefits, the US benefits, et cetera. Just to unpack that a little bit more, you asked earlier, it seems a little different, the approach the administration is taking to AI innovation, and maybe unpack that and then come back to the, how I think about that in the context of the export control question specifically. So shortly after he came into office, President Trump issued an executive order that established as the administration's policy that the US will lead the world in AI innovation. And this past week after we launched Llama 4, David Sachs, who's the White House AI czar, his reaction to Llama 4's launch was that the US leading in open source is a really important part of this overall strategy for the US to be the leader in the world when it comes to these things. Why do I think he said that? Well, if we look at the history of computing, open source technologies that are openly available for people to build on top of, typically become the platform of choice for the rest of the world. So you look at Linux, you look at Android, you look at encryption, a lot of the foundational technologies that the internet is based on, those exist and were broadly adopted because they were open sourced. And so the reason why I think that the administration is enthusiastic about this, and Tarun alluded to this earlier, and I think this, the Biden administration had similar views on this, is the same reason that Meta is so invested in it, which is our theory is if we open source world-leading technology, let the world build a community, an ecosystem of developers who will build on top of it, we will make more progress, we will get farther faster by working together than if we were to just build something unilaterally in Menlo Park. And so if that's true, then what we want to do is we want to achieve those wins together quickly, and create the incentives for the world community to work with us on that. And so I think that if you look at sort of what that means for export controls, obviously if you are export controlling putting aside, I think others can talk about the chips and the diffusion, which I think we've spent a bunch of time on. But when it comes to export controlling the model, it just sort of fundamentally disrupts the basic economics of that strategy if you do it. And so I just think it's it's hard to see that as a thing that makes sense for the U.S. government. I don't want to overstate it, though. There are certainly people in Washington who are concerned about exporting models for national security purposes and things like that. And so I imagine it will be a discussion. But I think fundamentally, if you believe what I just said, which is that open source, the models that are open source, the leading models that are open sourced will become a platform on which the world builds. And if the US says, hey, we're going to export control that and just not participate in that space, then we were talking earlier about DeepSeek. China will just take that space, and it's very obvious that they're positioned to do that if we don't. And so I think that's not in the US interest to allow that to happen.
Very quickly, India will host the AI Impact Summit, first quarter of next year. US articulation is AI for dominance. Indian articulation is AI for impact. The two could be mutually inclusive. Is there a trust play? Maybe this is just a thought to keep in mind. Is there a trust play when it comes to the Impact Summit? Is to use a platform of collective agency with 100 countries around the world, every big company, to build out trust?
I mean, I think so. I think, the history of the summits, and, they started in the UK, and I think have become more focused on action and impact and sort of building together as time has gone on. I think there's a real opportunity, and I think, the Indian government is still in the early stages of planning this, but I think there's a real opportunity to actually build things together ahead of the summit so that we can build trust by showing that collaboratively developing, and I mean, I alluded earlier to some of the projects that we're already doing here in India, some that we're collaborating with, some that are just Indian developers that are using our technology, and that's true for lots of things, not just Meta. But I think, my hope is that coming together in February will be an opportunity to see how the policies that were adopted at the White House earlier this year have led to an ecosystem where people can build really incredible things together, and the countries can coexist and have mutually beneficial relationship.
Siddharth, we left off on the API conversation. Both sides, at least the political establishment, seems to be clear that let's find some way to de-risk APIs. That's a big impetus, especially from the US side. Is there a potential business model to do this?
So it has to be explored. Yesterday we had a very productive discussion at the closed door session. Across the board, probably no, because two things you have to keep in mind. I think the two of the biggest challenges that we are grappling with are one, that the pricing. I mean, the US government or what US government can secure or can commit on is a very small fraction of the overall pharmaceutical market in the US. Maybe it's 20% of the market. So 80% is still driven by a different trade where US government does not really have a play, and the pricing environment, the policies, the FTC rules are really not coming handy because it's left to the players to decide, and everybody's like, with so many suppliers, the pricing is really under pressure. So that's one. So unless there's a stable pricing framework and a commitment from the government to do like long-term offtake agreements and underwrite supplies at an agreed price, it's not going to be easy. The second aspect is the cost, and I think is linked back to the first aspect. I think we all know that manufacturing for all segments moved to China for a reason, which was a cost arbitrage over decades. And now you're trying to reverse it. So there's a price to pay. And in our industry, I'll just give an example that if a drug or API is made at X price in China, it's 1.25 to 1.3x in India. And the analysis we have done is if we have to do the same thing in the US, it's going to be 2x. So who's going to pay the price to bring back manufacturing in the US? And I think what we have to really understand is why are we trying to do it is national security, right, of essential drugs. So first, those essential drugs, we have to treat it differently than high value differentiated drugs. And where I see definitely an opportunity for manufacture in US is these high value differentiated drugs. So there are drugs such as peptides, the GLP-1s, or oncology drugs. These are not volume driven. So scale does not have such an important role. So unlike antibiotics, right, where the scale is so critical. And that's why China is a leader in antibiotics. So there is a possibility. We need to sit down and agree on a way forward. But I'm not saying it should not be done. It should be done. And we definitely can find ways. And India and US can be strategic partners in finding the right solution.
No, thanks, Siddharth. And national security, state subsidies, industrial policy. I don't know if that's the place over here. I'm going to do a bit of a rapid fire, but I'm going to just give you a heads up. I'm going to come to each one of you and ask you to put an idea in the trust box that's not in the roadmap and that's not in the joint statement. So think of that as you think of everything else. John, if I can come to you, we left off the last conversation on onshoring, friendshoring. Mr. Pal eloquently outlined the American interest and investments in India on semiconductors through ISET. I think it's safe to say today that Micron was an electrifier in the ecosystem in many different ways. Do you see a contradiction between MAGA and what some now call MEGA?
Yeah, so there, I don't see a contradiction. I think that it's important for us.
Sorry, John, just the mic.
I thought you were going to ask me about tariffs, so I'm so glad you didn't. As we think about our bilateral future and our cooperation within trust and within the BTA, we shouldn't over-index on the tariff piece of it. There's no doubt about it, that's really important, but more emphasis needs to be given on the non-tariff barriers. And that's been talked about in Washington quite a bit. There's customs problems, there's siting regulations that need to be streamlined. And if we don't get that right, we're not going to be able to fulfill the promise of what's embedded in the trust agreement. The AI piece of it is just a kind of a bold new territory for us to run into. And a lot of the problems we're facing with building out AI here in India are the same problems we face with building out more manufacturing semiconductors in India. I think we should keep that in mind, and I think we should keep a laser focus on the NTBs.
Since you brought up tariffs, Indrani, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Ashley. How much of trust is going to be shaped by the extent to which we make movement on tariffs, whatever that movement might be? Sweeteners, early harvest, lots of negotiation, lots of talk time, difficulties on both sides. Are the two connected, or do you see the two, will we manage to move the two parallelly?
The second being the nuclear piece?
Second being all the other tech stuff that we've been talking about, including nuclear, which I'm guessing is a huge sweetener. If nuclear happened, great. So since you put it, will we do the CLND? And two, tariffs and trust, can the two move together, or is there a sequential logic to this?
So CLNDA will be amended. It's not such a difficult amendment. A far more difficult amendment is the amendment of the Atomic Energy Act. And as far as I know, both task forces are at work right now. Tariffs and the other pieces should not work together and in tandem. In the case of movement on tariffs should not affect, say, defense or ITAR or, export controls or the other stuff. What will affect it is the intangible, and that is trust comes out of an understanding that the interests of the two countries are convergent. If we are agreeable on that particular principle, we will be able to work on the tariff front as well as on the nuclear front.
Ashley, if I can come to you, defense, not typically in the trust paragraph, but same ecosystem. Under ISET, some big wins, MQ-9B, engines, lots of work on export controls, 80% TOT, some hair-raising moments towards the end because of Congress and other issues. What do you genuinely see today as new avenues for general partnership between the US and India when it comes to defense, and why was there a line on F-35s?
If I knew why there was a line on F-35s, I would have told you. But
I thought you wrote it.
I wouldn't take that seriously. In the best case, you read that as an ambition that the US has, a signaling device to India to say, nothing is going to be off the table. We're going to work with you on even the best equipment that the US has, right? But broadly speaking on defense, I think the transformations that have been underway over the last 20 years are going to continue. I do not see them stopping. What I am concerned about is the pace. I think the pace is going to be much slower than both sides would like. And increasingly that is driven by the fact that at the Indian end, the focus is on technology not connected to operations, at least not connected to cooperative or joint operations. So the moment you focus on technology outside of operations, then the US treats it as a discrete piece on the table, and then you get into all kinds of bureaucratic conniptions about whether we should permit it or not. But if you think of a piece of technology in the context of things that the United States and India are operationally going to do together, then the incentive structure at the US end changes dramatically. And so my view is, obviously there are some things India will want to do apart from operations, and we will win some, we'll lose some. But to my mind, the avenue for future acceleration really has to come from a different model. And that model has to be, we have to do things together in ways that matter to the interests of both countries. And this is where I think the Indian Ocean space is really ripe for progress, because for us, it's an economy of force theater. We don't have the resources to put into this like we do in the Pacific. The idea of space cooperation is a huge opportunity. And third, I would say the area of defensive cyber. Because as we grow more interconnected in other areas of economic and technological activity, we want to make certain that whatever is lodged in India is not going to be vulnerable. And so the whole question of defensive cyber is really something that we have only tipped our toes into the water on, and represent huge opportunities for us.
So military integration, exercises, special forces integration, let's work together maybe even on undersea capabilities, will in fact provide the ambition for a lot of the other stuff which may be disconnected from the ground of wherever that's happening. Okay? Mr. Pal, if I could for a second take you out of the typical trust hat and ask you, is we're just launching, or you're in the process of launching ISM 2.0. 3 years ago, at a forum such as this, in fact exactly like this, a lot of people said there is just no way in which India will get a semiconductor ecosystem. There were more naysayers than yes-sayers when it came to semiconductors. But as you've just outlined, a lot has happened, not just with the US, with other firms. We have alliances between Indian companies, Taiwanese companies, and so on and so forth. What's the next 5 years for the next version of ISM?
I mean, do I still have to answer that? What is the missing piece in the trust as a part of the rapid fire?
We'll give you that as a pass.
Okay. And I shouldn't be kind of above my pay grade to making a kind of a policy statements here, because, however, I mean, it is for the industry to kind of read between the statements made by the leaders, right? I think we have made a very phenomenal progress in the ISM 1.0. I think almost all of the incentive or budget provided, roughly $10 billion, is committed for for projects ranging from the fabrication to the packaging to the compound semiconductors, and I mean maybe micro LEDs as well. I mean, so so it's a pretty vast space and diverse space. Only missing piece is display fab. We already got 5 projects approved. Couple of 4 or 5 might be in pipeline, and we might see the announcement very soon. So that part is fully kind of done, and it's a because of the strong interest shown by the company, that's a fully saturated piece. Yes, we are in discussion with the various companies with regard to and with the various stakeholders as to how the policy should shape up, and the intent is actually to look at a broader approach to the not only the fab, packaging, and the compound, or in 3 or 4 categories, but but looking at the complete value chain of the semiconductors. And as a result, though we don't have a Silicon 2.0 or a policy wherein the equipments are being covered here, but still you have I think companies which are operating into the R&D and the equipment space, and as well as in the space of as tiny a thing, something like a materials or materials or the solder paste, which are very essential element of the supply chain, which are being used to kind of paste the chip to a substrate. So even and Honorable PM has made an announcement that we intend becoming a $5 billion by 2030, 31, and so I think yes, we are positive. I think the intent of the government is definitely to give a policy stability to the industry with regard to the semiconductor ecosystem. So I mean, I'll leave it at that note. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Everyone's fixated on the trust framework and a delivery by the end of this month with a potential big visit. But beyond this month, looking to the future, one idea from your vantage point that should be put in the trust box, it could just be a puzzle that people should work on. Siddharth.
I mean, I really can't think of anything specific. There is a lot which has already been discussed, and I think we just have to come up with ideas. So nothing specific that I can think of.
Rob?
Well, I talked earlier about the building blocks that I think are important for a robust and successful AI endeavor. And so the first is a collaborative AI ecosystem, a collaborative developer ecosystem. We have that. The second is infrastructure. That's a core part of what's enumerated in the trust framework. And then the third is data. And that's something that both of the governments have done some work on, but I think is really foundational for us to be able to build world-class AI that is going to serve the needs of both countries. And I think that's something that I hope will be discussed more.
Okay, great. And Rahul will be picking up on there's a full data conversation tomorrow. Indrani.
For us to be able to get that trade agreement as soon as we can.
So an action point rather than an idea. Like it just has to happen.
It is an action point because it is an action point that will inform every other points of action.
And we have the minister this evening who will hopefully be talking to some of these issues. Ashley.
I just want to, well, I won't say two things, but I want to endorse what Indrani just said, because this is not a logical problem, it's an empirical problem. If the administration has stated that it's a priority, then we have to deal with it because it becomes a door opener. On the idea of what can we do next, I think one thing that we haven't explored, both from trust, the acronym, and trust, the noun, is the idea of opening our functional warfighting schools to Indian personnel. I mean, we've never done that at all. And we've come to the stage where the Indian Armed Forces operate American equipment. They are increasingly sort of appreciating American TTPs and so on and so forth. So I think the next logical step is to take representatives from the armed forces into our functional schools and run them through the gamut of training and so on and so forth, so that the equipment they have can be used much more effectively.
Quickly. John?
All right. Very quickly, I would drop a stopwatch into that trust box because time is of the essence. As I mentioned earlier, our supply chains, which build our foundational technologies, which are critical to everything we've talked about here, are diversifying at an accelerating rate. If India is going to capture more of that, India's got to move quickly. So it's a stopwatch.
Speed. Last word, sir. Mr. Pal.
Wish that it should have contained something like reciprocal tariff would not kick in till the time the BTA is signed.
I think that's a very good idea, and Ashley, you can take that back if you want to. But with that, thank you so very much. Time is up. I'm sorry I forgot about questions, but very enriching, lots of ideas, lots to take forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you for an insightful discussion on US-India tech cooperation. We now break for coffee. It's served outside. Please help yourself, and we'll return in a bit.